Good afternoon. We're going to get started. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Marcy, and I'm the president of Dominican University of California, and we are honored and pleased to serve as a convening for this very important community town hall. So welcome to Dominican. I'll tell you a couple of quick things about Dominican and a couple of quick things about this conversation, and then I am going to get out of the way because I think we have a lot to discuss given the topic. One of the things you need to know about Dominican is that this event comes at the end of an academic year where we focused on a community engagement theme called Democracy and Equity. We had a Mellon grant to bring that into the classroom and beyond the classroom, and it's been a very active year, and we think it was one of the most important questions we could ask this year. We basically said that our democracy cannot flourish without some sense of equity, and we knew that that sense of equity was in peril. That conversation only became more intense in January after the fall elections. Most importantly, Dominican has long been a friend of Congressman Jared Huffman. He's known the university well before he became a congressman, but I was just saying to him, I think the first time he and I were on the stage, I was moderating a debate when he first ran for this congressional seat, and it said to me, what's something that I think we all know, which is he has no trouble showing up for town halls and debates and being held accountable. I'm going to tell you one personal story about the congressman and his staff. One of the things I did this spring after the elections, Dominican has many students from all backgrounds. We have many scholars and faculty and staff from all parts of the world, and I was concerned about their protection and their safety, and there are a lot of statements from Washington saying we have your back. And so I actually went to the offices and said, what does that mean? And Congressman Huffman and Jenny and their team immediately said, here's who you call if you have trouble. Here's what we'll do if you have any issues with any of your faculty, students, or staff. So when he says he has our backs, he means it, and I'm deeply grateful for that. But this conversation is not actually about Dominican, and it's not actually even about Congressman Huffman. It is about holding the executive branch accountable, and I don't think any of us knew quite how much of a moving target that was going to be, including today. So I'm going to turn the stage over to folks who have deep experience in this area, and please welcome not only Congressman Huffman to the stage, but his panelist, Margaret Russell, the Associate Professor of Law at Santa Clara University School of Law, Sara Eisenberg, the Deputy City Attorney in San Francisco, and Caroline Fredrickson, President of the American Constitution Society for Law and Policy. Please know that as Marin's only four-year institution of higher education, we take seriously our role in the community. We're thrilled to have you here. This is an important conversation. Thanks for showing up, and take it away.
Well, thank you, President Marcy, and would you please join me in thanking Dominican University and President Marcy in holding us? Thank you. I want to acknowledge the presence of some of my partners in local government who are joining us today. We've got Marin County Supervisor Kate Sears, San Rafael Councilman Damon Connolly, from the San Rafael City School Board, Rachel Kurtz, from the College of Marin Board of Trustees, Wandine Triner, and the Honorable Fade Opal, retired judge. By now, I hope all of you have figured out that we're going to try to use comment cards to guide this discussion, and those cards are going to be moving up and down the aisles for my staff. Michelle here is holding some of them. So I hope that you will put your hand up and ask for one if you need one, and then just pass them to the end of the aisle. We'd like to collect them continuously over the course of our conversation, and my staff will sort them and bring them to me. We're not going to screen anything or filter anything, but they might combine questions if they cover the same subject so that we don't duplicate things. And we'll just try in that way to cover as much ground as we can tonight. This was an important and timely conversation before this afternoon. And here we are, faced with another piece of breaking news, another bombshell that President Trump just hours ago decided, just as investigations were beginning to get a little closer to his inner circle and the personal, financial, and political ties to Russia, he decided in this moment it was time to fire the FBI Director, James Comey. So that's today's bombshell, and we'll see what the days ahead bring us. But I want to tell you that this town hall, I'm thrilled to see the turnout. We've been getting incredible crowds everywhere we go. And I've been doing a lot of these. This is my 11th town hall since December. And this wonderful crowd this evening is going to put us over 10,000 constituents addressed since December in these town hall meetings. I'm very proud of that, and we're not done. We're going to keep these community conversations going because I think people are hungry for it. And I think there's a real value of helping folks become informed so that they can take that information and figure out how to act on it and how to engage. Somehow my volume just went way up, but that's cool. All right. We've also been engaging young people in some record numbers in the last few months. I have met with about a whole bunch of school visits, 9 high school and middle schools in recent weeks, about 1,600 students to talk about our democracy, to talk about this moment in our history and the importance really of them being engaged citizens. And in every part of my district, across every demographic, at every age group, I can report to you that I'm finding people who are deeply worried about the threats posed by Donald Trump's presidency. Threats to basic values like just decency, kindness, and tolerance. Threats to democratic institutions. Threats to our environment and the progress we've made in confronting climate change in recent years. Threats to the social progress that we've made on civil rights and human rights and diversity and inclusion. Threats posed by the unprecedented number of billionaires and plutocrats who are filling this administration in key positions. Threats to the credibility and the moral standing of the United States on the world stage. And threats to peace and security around the world. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I think these threats are real. President Trump has brought a level of demagoguery, corruption, secrecy, and recklessness to the White House that I'm not sure our country has ever experienced. They almost make Watergate and Teapot Dome look quaint by comparison. And we're barely 100 days into this presidency. Now, there's a very famous saying, I think it's been attributed to various people over the years, but I'm pretty sure it was said by Edmund Burke. And that is, the only thing that is necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. And that's where I have some good news, folks, because we're not doing nothing. I can tell you that. People around this country, certainly around my district, they may be worried, they may be afraid, but they are shaking off the days of denial and despair, and they're engaging like never before. They're showing up in all kinds of ways. How many people here tonight are at their first town hall? All right, maybe 40%. A lot of my town halls recently, it's been the strong majority of the crowd are at their very first town hall of any kind. And by the way, Donald Trump thinks that that's because everybody's a paid protester, paid by George Soros. Can we just have you raise your hand if you're a paid protester here? Okay. I want to get that out of the way. So look, there is a powerful, positive movement growing around this country, and it is already making a difference. We have changed the narrative on the national health care debate as a result of this movement. We're pushing back on attempts to silence and intimidate scientists. We're refusing to let our communities be divided by those who would scapegoat immigrants and minorities. We're ready to take to the streets, to the courts, and ultimately to the ballot box to push back on this wrong-headed agenda. And I think that's why most of you are here tonight, to find out what can be done to hold President Trump accountable across probably a range of controversies that might be animating you. Maybe you're concerned about President Trump's personal and family business dealings that suggest violations of the Emoluments Clause and perhaps other laws. You should be concerned about that, by the way, despite incredible secrecy. We already know enough to suggest that there are deep, deep problems here. The $940 million loan from the Bank of China, apparently substantial foreign financing from Russian oligarchs. We don't know the exact level, but we have every reason to believe that has happened in the Trump organization. Pending trademark issues in China. Business partnerships with government implications in the Philippines, Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia, Emirates and Saudi Arabia, among other countries. And of course, the Trump son's continued pursuit of business deals around the globe, the Kushner family's apparent exploitation of control over immigration policies to leverage real estate investments from China. The conflicts of interest and the flouting of ethical standards from this administration are just breathtaking. So are the potential implications of President Trump's personal, financial, and political ties to Russia. And we also have the president's contempt for the law, as shown in overreaching and unlawful executive orders, which so far we've had good success in stopping. Some of our experts here tonight are going to talk to you a little bit about that. These are all areas that demand accountability from the institutions we count on to safeguard our democracy. Certainly from Congress in its oversight role, and I'm going to be doing everything I can to get my colleagues in Congress to actually step up and exercise that oversight authority in the right way. We're counting on accountability from the courts, and although this has been one heck of a stress test to our democracy so far, the institution of our judicial branch and the courts seems to be holding up, and we want to make sure that continues. And of course, from a free and independent press that informs and engages citizenry. So we have a fantastic panel here for you tonight to join me in this conversation. I know that the Trump administration and Mitch McConnell and folks back in Washington, they typically create panels of older white men. I thought I thought I'd show you what some powerful women lawyers can do. So welcome them here today. I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves because you've heard enough from me, but I think you're going to find their backgrounds and their qualifications truly outstanding and perfect for this conversation. We'll start with Caroline Fredrickson and go down the line.
Well, thank you so much for having me here, Congressman. It's really, an incredible pleasure to look out in a room like this. And whenever I have moments of doubt, I can visualize this and say, this is actually what democracy looks like. So thank you all so much for what you do. So I'm just going to introduce myself briefly, but I run a group called the American Constitution Society. I'm very pleased to have two active members up here with me on the panel. It's a real pleasure to have friends to speak on these important issues. But my organization, we work on the court system. We work to ensure that the judges who sit on the bench are fair, open-minded, diverse, and understand that the Constitution is actually a progressive document, that we are not bound by what people in the 18th century thought due process was. But in fact, we're in the 21st century and we should act accordingly. My organization has often been called the left version of the Federalist Society. Well, we have a lot of work to do, unfortunately, to undo the damage that they have done to our judiciary. Just a little bit briefly, besides at ACS, before that I ran the ACLU's legislative arm, their national legislative arm. And I worked many years on Capitol Hill as Chief of Staff to Senator from Washington State, Maria Cantwell, and for Tom Daschle. And I was the General Counsel and Legal Director of NARAL, Pro-Choice America. So, thank you.
Hello, my name is Margaret Russell, and yes, I am very proud to be affiliated with the American Constitution Society. My day job, though, is as a professor of constitutional law at Santa Clara University for a couple of decades and other schools from time to time. I teach constitutional law, restorative justice, civil procedure, and various civil rights and civil liberties courses. And my, I guess, major pro bono activity is with the National American Civil Liberties Union, which has really sustained me in probably a lot of years over the last couple of months. So the rest of my bio is here, but I look forward to talking to you about some of the legal issues.
My name is Sara Eisenberg, rounding out the lawyers here. I'd also like to thank the Congressman and all of you for coming, and thank Caroline for leading ACS, of which I too am a member of the board, and for bringing people together in this wonderful way. After graduating law school, here is a sort of interesting fact about my bio. I clerked for Donald Trump's older sister. Who is a federal judge in the Third Circuit in New Jersey, and a wonderful woman who I adore. I clerked for her, I clerked for a district judge, and then I clerked for Justice Stevens on the Supreme Court of the United States before moving out here to San Francisco, where I am currently a deputy city attorney in the San Francisco City Attorney's Office, and one of the lead litigators on our case against Donald Trump and the federal government to prevent implementation of his executive order to strip funds from sanctuary cities. Thank you. We've had some good successes so far, and I'm happy to talk more about that here today.
All right. So let's get started. I already made a mistake. I guess somehow I demoted our supervisor, Damon Connolly, to city councilman when I introduced him. So let me restore him to his proper position. I apologize for that oversight. I'd like to just kind of pick up on Sara Eisenberg's reference to the litigation involving sanctuary cities, and ask if she can give us a bit of an update. I know this is on a lot of people's mind. What is the status of the litigation? How do you feel about the legal recourse we have to prevent the Trump administration from trying to punish possibly the whole state of California and other jurisdictions around the country that are not interested in becoming immigration police?
Short answer, we feel good. I'll expand on that a little bit, but that's the short answer. You know, we were well prepared. Before he took office, Donald Trump issued, his promise of what he was going to do in his first 100 days, and among those were strip fundings from sanctuary cities. And so we sat down with that document and we started thinking about what are we going to do if he follows through on these threats. So when he issued that executive order in January, we were ready to go, and we were able to file a lawsuit very quickly and get into court. We moved for a preliminary injunction, which essentially asks the court to maintain the current situation and not let him do anything under that executive order while we litigate the case. And we got an order in our favor 2 weeks ago enjoining the federal government from enforcing the sections of this executive order that would strip funds from sanctuary jurisdictions. It was great. It was 49 pages long. It was well thought out. It was well researched. It was a work of art as far as we are concerned. The judge went with us, down the line on basically every argument that we made. Really solid piece of work. So far, they have not yet filed an appeal, the federal government. They have 60 days to do so, so we are waiting to see if they will. Meanwhile, we are gearing up for our next steps. So, this is a great victory, and another good victory that came out of this is that the government, as we have seen them do in many areas recently, has actually started to retreat. So Trump and his administration come out of the gate swinging hard with big words about what they're doing. But once people start pushing back and standing up to the bully and saying, wait a minute, you can't do that, that's not okay, they start to retreat, and that's what we saw here. So by the time we got into court, the administration was saying, no, that's not what we meant. We're not coming for all of that money. We're only coming for these $20 that you have in your pocket right now. And so even just seeing how we can, just by pushing back against some of the really outlandish things that are happening, make good progress. But we're not resting there, right? So they say things, but we got to hold their feet to the fire when they start to retreat. And so we got this order, and we're going to keep pushing to get a final judgment. We feel good about it. We're going to keep pushing forward, and hopefully that all continues to go as well as it has so far.
Well done. Well done. Just another point of personal privilege before we jump into the questions. You would think that a guy who has been sued as much as Donald Trump and used lawyers to sue and intimidate other people as much as he had would know the difference between a federal district court and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. But no sooner had that initial decision come down than he attacked the Ninth Circuit, which hadn't yet even ruled. It's an appellate body. But clearly, between that and his attacks on the Mexican heritage of a previous judge and Jeff Sessions' attacks trying to belittle a judge from Hawaii, there is this pattern in this administration of trying to demean, if not intimidate, the judiciary to get its way. And I would ask all three of our panelists for your thoughts on that, whether it'll be effective and what is the broader impact of something like that when a president of the United States adopts those kind of tactics against our independent judiciary.
I'll start with that. I mean, that's actually been a fundamental focus of the American Constitution Society's work, which is protecting the independence of the judiciary.
Is it working?
I don't think this one.
Yeah.
It's working.
That's better.
Now it's working.
Yeah, that's not a good idea.
Okay, that one's not working.
We're just
All right,
gonna...
we'll swap.
Separate them, I think.
Yeah, we'll swap these. Okay, this one is better. Okay. So obviously the independence of the judiciary is a fundamental part of the structure of our government, the separation of powers. It depends on the courts having their independent role. It's actually, it's interesting to think back. Alexander Hamilton's famous for many things now. But in the Federalist Papers, he describes the courts as being the least dangerous branch because they have neither purse nor sword. So, the executive branch has armies, the legislative branch has money, they have ways of enforcing their will, whereas the courts don't have either of those things. And so what happens is that our whole system of law is dependent on, to some extent, respect. Respect for the system, and that when courts issue decisions, their decisions are followed. And when that doesn't happen, then we have a constitutional crisis. And so what is dangerous about what Donald Trump does is that when he attacks Judge Curiel, who was the judge with the Mexican-American heritage, who ruled in the Trump University case, calls him a disgrace. Judge Robarts in Washington State, who issued the first decision blocking the Muslim ban, called him a so-called judge. And then when Jeff Sessions, or as my mother likes to call him always, Jefferson Beauregard Sessions, when he calls a judge, he says, there's a judge who's on some island in Hawaii or some island in the Pacific. When he gets the right to tell the president what to do, that's a problem. And I thought, wait, this is our attorney general. He doesn't understand the district court system. So there's a lot at stake here. I think it's incredibly dangerous. It's a dangerous moment, I think. And so that's why it's so important to have forums like this, to have members of Congress like Congressman Huffman, because obviously the legislative branch has to do something, but the courts are a vital piece of this, and we all really need to work hard to ensure that that court system stands, but because without it, we really don't have a way of holding Donald Trump, his administration, or anybody accountable?
Well, so I was actually singing the songs of the Hamilton musical coming up here, and they actually are a soundtrack for our lives, right? There's a song that says, "We're not throwing away our shot. We're young, scrappy, and hungry. We're not throwing away our shot." Well, we may not be young, or at least I'm not, but we're scrappy and hungry really for democracy. And the question that the Congressman asked about the judiciary is really something incredibly important, because without the judiciary, the first two articles, Article 1 and Article 2 of the Constitution, essentially are a nullity. Right? If the name of this is holding the executive branch accountable, well, we as the people can hold the executive branch accountable. The legislature can hold the executive branch accountable. But all of that is really subject to vagaries of time and place and different popular beliefs and who is in office. But the judiciary, in interpreting the Constitution, really supposed to have, it does have an obligation, a constitutional obligation, to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. So when we have an administration, and this is really troubling, an executive branch and a president who I think, I'm not sure if I would think that, that the president would necessarily know about the structure of government, because that wasn't at all in his background. It really wasn't part of the job interview, and it is something that we probably don't educate our own children about enough. So when he is celebrating with beer about having a bill passed through the House and may not realize that the Senate has yet to review it and may not approve it, as with the health care bill, you know, I think that's reflective. It's really, I wouldn't call it stupidity, but it is a very scary level of ignorance that should be concerning for anyone who wants a qualified person in the job. Now, it doesn't mean that every president has to be a constitutional lawyer or a lawyer at all, but one would think that having a background in Congress, having a background in public life, would give you a sense of what government is supposed to be and how there are checks and balances. And I think that the executive branch really sees it more of, you know, a war of attrition rather than checks and balances.
I guess the only thing I would add, I actually think this is the most frightening thing about our president. I think it's beyond a frightening ignorance. I think there's a disrespect and a disdain for the other branches of government that we have not seen before. And for that level of disregard for these co-equal and equally important branches of the government to be so apparent in our executive is, in my view, a truly frightening moment for us.
To the point of adopting Andrew Jackson, right, as his sort of animal spirit, right?
That's right. Yeah. And you know, if it were just ignorance, then maybe there could be education. But I think it's beyond ignorance. It really is a disregard and a belief in this sort of presidential fiat and ability to run roughshod over the other branches. So I think it becomes of utmost critical importance for the other branches and for local and state governments to exert themselves to counteract that deep disdain and disrespect. So I really think you've hit on what is the most frightening part.
I just wanted to add to that. I think the phrase that I think best captures it was said by Ben Wittes, who is a conservative commentator who called around the whole Muslim ban the Trump administration's actions malevolent incompetence.
Mm-hmm. Incompetence tempered.
Oh, yes.
Malevolence tempered only by incompetence.
There you go. Even better. Yes,
okay.
That's
I'm
right.
glad we can laugh at this stuff. Okay. Well, thank you. I think that's an important opening conversation, really, about checks and balances and accountability and where the courts and judicial independence fit into all of this. I've got a bunch of questions about Russia and James Comey, so we'll get into a few of these. We're going to go to the audience now. And the first one is, how can we get an independent committee to investigate Trump and Russia? And can Trump and Sessions control the new FBI director that they select? So I'm going to open this up to anyone who wants to speak, but I will just tell you that I am continuing to call for an independent commission to be created by Congress because I don't have confidence. I don't have a high degree of confidence that either of the partisan-led Intelligence Committee efforts are going to really do the job. And there's lots of reasons why. Over in the Senate, they have hardly anyone even staffing that effort. It's moving at a snail's pace. We did have an interesting hearing this week in Lindsey Graham's subcommittee, but we're nowhere close to where we should be if serious oversight was actually taking place. There would be subpoenas and all kinds of activity that we're not yet seeing. Over on the House side, of course, we have Devin Nunes, who was almost an agent of Donald Trump, trying to thwart serious investigation, canceling hearings that Sally Yates was supposed to testify at, and ultimately getting caught at it in the most ham-handed way and having to recuse himself from this investigation. But he's still the chair of that committee. So make no mistake, all the people who staff that committee, all the things that happen under the aegis of that committee are going to have Devin Nunes's effect on them. So the answers, in my opinion, from the congressional side of this accountability is to create an independent, nonpartisan commission and do it right. Now, there's also the investigation going on at the FBI. And that's where this question, the second part of this question comes in. Can Trump and Sessions control the new FBI director that they select? And it is complicated. We know that Sessions had to recuse himself from anything involving the investigation into Russia's interference with the election. And there is a career professional prosecutor that's number 2 in line at the Department of Justice who then would have the call on those type of decisions. The Department of Justice is over the Federal Bureau of Investigation, so that should provide us at least some degree of comfort that Jeff Sessions won't be leaning in on the FBI. However, we now have the FBI director being fired, and we're going to see who the Trump administration nominates. They're going to have to go through Senate confirmation. That could take a long, long time. Best case is they have really slowed down probably the investigation, and who knows why. But this is, yeah, we all know why, right? So to me, the takeaway is that what we really need is a special prosecutor. And that can only be done by the Attorney General. The Attorney General would need to do that, and since Sessions has recused himself from that, that would fall to his number 2 in command. And there's already, I think, a drumbeat coming from Washington. I heard our Democratic Senate leader call for the appointment of a special prosecutor. Certainly, I'm going to echo that call, and many others will, and I think that's how we make sure that Jeff Sessions doesn't have his finger on the scale. Yeah.
So when I ran the ACLU's legislative arm during the Bush administration, we faced some similar issues. Sadly, torture was a problem that the Bush administration developed its whole new program of enhanced interrogation. And when it finally started to come out, it's clearly in violation of multiple statutes, the Geneva Conventions, et cetera, et cetera. There were videotapes that were made at Guantanamo and other black sites that showed the waterboarding and other types of these procedures. Those were destroyed. At that point, the Bush administration was actually forced to appoint an independent counsel or special counsel who would act separately from the Attorney General. And so I think there's clearly precedent for that. I mean, if those of us who care about civil rights and civil liberties could do that and force President Bush and his Justice Department to appoint a special counsel, we certainly should be able to do that at this moment when our national interests are threatened so much by Russians, our elections are targeted, our president is possibly compromised. His Attorney General has had to recuse himself. There could not be a better example of the need for a special counsel than we have at this moment. And I have to say, as Congressman and I were talking before about Russia, we both speak a little Russian. I actually majored in Russian in college, and I thought as I went on to become a lawyer and get involved in American politics that it would never actually be useful. But now it is, so добрый день.
Comes full circle. Well, so now it's my turn to be more negative. And that yes, we passed that hat around. So I don't see an independent prosecutor or independent counsel as being a panacea, and I realize that no one else is saying that. And it really is because of the history of how that position has been or could be manipulated, or that person could be fired, at least as if you remember Archibald Cox and the Saturday Night Massacre. I think the only force, frankly, that makes independent prosecutors independent and forces people like Sessions to recuse themselves are people's voices in the room and members of Congress, because there is no sort of magical rule that forces somebody to recuse themselves, and there is no magical rule or even code of ethics in the Trump administration that would suggest some guidepost for being an independent counsel. So I think it's going to be up to us, and as tired as many people have said they are after just a couple of months, we are going to have to be eternally vigilant, because the independence is not going to exist without us.
Yeah, I guess this is sort of when I was thinking about what is my overall theme going to be for today, this is kind of my overall theme, so I might as well start hitting it now. I feel like it can be sometimes hard living in a blue bubble, in a blue state, in blue jurisdictions, to know what we can do, how we can put pressure on, and how we can make our voices heard. Because we have oftentimes, hopefully, representatives who reflect our views. And so you hear a lot of people saying, well, call your representatives. And so, well, does that still hold true for us when, our representatives are not on the fence? And when I was thinking about this, and actually I'm going to put this question, I think, to the Congressman, but what I think is that I think it still does matter. I think that even living in blue states with blue representatives at the state, local, federal level, calling your representatives and letting them know that this is a priority. There are so many things that need to be addressed right now in politics. And so telling people who are on our side, who are in positions of political power, that we support them in calling for a nonpartisan commission, in calling for a special prosecutor, and that we will have their backs and we will come out and vote for them and flyer for them and help them if they stand up for us. I think, and Congressman, I ask you, but I think that is still critically important. Is that right?
I think it does. I think it's validating and informative to hear from constituents whether they agree with you or not. Yeah.
So I just want to add to that. Oh, that's right. That's the bad one, the evil one. That I think your senators are also very important in this. And I would remind you that Senator Feinstein was actually amazingly strong with the torture report. She's been thwarted every single which way. She's no longer the top Democrat on the Intelligence Committee. She moved over to the Judiciary Committee, but she still has a very important role. She knows a lot about what the Intelligence Committee does. So I think pushing on her as well to make sure she maintains a fierce intensity around what's happened with this administration, the variety of issues, but certainly the things that are being investigated, or at least we hope are, in the Intelligence Committee. As the Congressman noted, they don't actually have any investigators, so I'm not sure they're investigating yet. But voices like Senator Feinstein's are very well respected in the Senate. She has an amazing amount of authority, so speak to her. Tell her that this is what matters to you.
So we have a couple of questions specific to the firing of James Comey.
Already?
Yeah, some breaking stuff. One of them is about what Democrats and others will do to ensure an investigation into all of these issues in light of Comey's firing today. I think we talked about that with the possible special prosecutor and other options. But the other one is, can anything be done to censor Attorney General Sessions for interfering in the Russia investigation and recommending Comey's firing? I literally heard about this firing in the car on the way over here. So I don't know the details about how involved Jeff Sessions was, although I'm sort of hearing tweets and things that he may have recommended it, which would be deeply troubling.
The president's letter says references.
Yeah, so maybe I can invite any of my fellow panelists who might know a little more about that to chime in.
Well, you can chime in if I misheard this, but as I was driving through all the traffic, I understand that the explanation, perhaps pretext, really talks about the performance of James Comey in the discussion of the Hillary Clinton emails and the failure to correct the record and a decision last summer during the campaign to actually weigh in sort of on the merits, even as they said we've concluded the investigation. So if you believe that that's really it, then I don't know. Then you can believe that I'm purple today. But there actually is an explanation, and ostensibly it has absolutely nothing to do with current conduct of the job. Is that what you?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I heard.
Well, I would say that the letter, in which it references the role of the Attorney General and the Deputy Rod Rosenstein, who is the designee on Russia, that they were part of the decision. It also says from Donald Trump to Comey, which is sort of amusing if it weren't so frightening. I know you told me 3 times that you're not investigating me, but I'm still firing you. I mean, it really, he kind of underlines the subtext of what's leading to the firing, even as he claims that somehow he has, a room in his heart to feel compassion for Hillary Clinton.
Right. Lock her up. So here's a question about self-dealing and conflicts of interest. It's a question about recourse for some of these signs of, as I said earlier, breathtaking conflicts of interest, self-dealing, possibly Emoluments Clause violations, and a related question, are there any signs of bipartisan concern about the president concealing and dissembling and not being honest with the American people about these things? I'll just take the last part of that question, and then I think we've got some real experts on these conflicts and Emolument Clause issues. I'll hand off to them. But there's not nearly as much bipartisan concern as I would expect and I would hope on what I would regard as an obvious pattern of lying and dissembling and concealment. But there are a few Republican colleagues of mine who have called for Donald Trump to release his tax returns. That's a good start. I was just, on my podcast, I just had Mark Sanford from South Carolina as my guest, and we talked a little bit about this. I give a lot of credit to my Republican colleagues who've shown the guts to come out with a position like that. However, Democrats have tried a bunch of ways to actually force votes on this. We've done a whole bunch of privileged resolutions. The Ways and Means Committee actually has a mechanism to force disclosure of Donald Trump's tax returns, and we've called for votes on that. So far, my colleagues across the aisle have been unwilling to put their votes where their position, at least previously, had been. So I think we're just going to have to keep the public pressure up on that, and eventually I think we will get bipartisan support in the House we can do this, to require Donald Trump to produce his tax returns, at least in a confidential setting for the Ways and Means Committee. We'll see whether we can get them for other purposes. But to the broader conflicts and Emolument Clause issues, I'll look to our experts.
So this is a very interesting and difficult issue for a couple reasons. First is that, as the Congressman mentioned, the particular allocation of power between the President and the Congress is such that it will take some movement from Congress in order for Trump even to think for a second that he's obligated to do anything. And we've seen so far just a very clear pattern of behavior from the president, which is that, well, I'm the president, so who's going to stop me from doing this? And so other people have said, well, what about this Emoluments Clause that nobody ever talked about before this time? Well, it is there. And interestingly, so I'm sorry, I'm going to be a little nerdy. So when I teach Article 1 powers of Congress in the Constitution, Article 2 powers of the President, and then Article 3, the powers of the courts, the Emoluments Clause is actually in Article 1 with regard to the Congress. And why, you may say, is that? Because the Emoluments Clause, or the Title of Nobility Clause, was basically put into the original Constitution out of concern that public officials, federal government officials, would take bribes, right? That they would receive gifts and other titles of nobility, et cetera, emoluments, payments, compensation from foreign governments that would compromise their integrity, essentially. So it's in this part of the Constitution because it says that those emoluments cannot be accepted, those gifts from foreign governments, unless it is allowed by Congress. Now, has Congress allowed any of this? No. What would happen if Congress explicitly passed legislation to repudiate it? Then at least there would be a chance of having, I think, an actionable controversy about it. There is one lawsuit that I know of that was filed in Washington, D.C., first by a public integrity organizations like Citizens for Good Government, Citizens for Ethics. And that is alleging a violation of the Emoluments Clause, that the president violated the Constitution. In short, that is kind of sort of loping along rather slowly, with some thinking it'll never get through the front door of adjudication because an organization that is bringing it up can't establish the required injury. So if somebody's injured by the president's accepting foreign gifts, maybe that would have to be the hotel or whatever business that was suffering. So they've added a couple of other plaintiffs who may or may not have the lawsuit actually reach a decision-making process. But in the meantime, the ACLU has filed a Freedom of Information Act request to get more information about the president's business dealings. We'll see what comes of that. And once again, I guess I have to say that this is really a situation in which the courts will probably not resolve this, at least not very easily. And unless there is this sea wave in Congress to really force the issue with Trump, which I don't think there's going to be, it will have to be up to us, meaning organized resistance. It will have to definitely be a very strong press, as there has been, and that's going to have to continue. Because the more the president, I guess people are saying, normalizes it, the more it goes on. Oh, sure, this is my son-in-law. Sure, this is my daughter. People just sort of, after a while, they think, well, what else can we do? So we're going to have to push back a lot harder and not let them normalize it.
We've been working quite a bit on the Emoluments Clause, my organization, with CREW, which is Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, as well as a variety of law professors, Erwin Chemerinsky from Irvine here in California, who's on our board, Larry Tribe, and others. And the new plaintiffs actually really strengthen the case because they, for example, the idea is somebody has to come in and say, I've been harmed. And one of the plaintiffs is a woman who represents hotels in D.C. that get business from embassies to throw parties, and all of a sudden she gets some kind of a percentage, and she's not getting as much business anymore because all the parties are going to the Trump hotel, and that's all money that's flowing from foreign governments to Donald Trump's family. So obviously, there's a potential violation that the court might recognize, at least an injury, to allow the case to go forward. But Margaret's absolutely right that one of the issues in that case that's more difficult is what's the remedy, because the Congress can allow it. Congress could take some other action, but because it's never been litigated, because who knew? I really didn't know there was an Emoluments Clause. I knew you did because you were.
It's not talked about. Before this administration.
There's also Domestic Emoluments Clause, though, which is also relevant, which is actually an absolute bar. That says no local state government, it says no state, but local governments are assumed to be part of that, can provide any kind of emolument whatsoever. It says whatsoever. And there's no ability to waive that in any way. And so there are other lawsuits potentially coming forward that will look at localities that may be granting special abatements or tax benefits to Trump hotels, or his sons have the Zion hotels. or other, other parts of the Trump organization that are getting special benefits. So, that's all moving forward. Again, the remedies are harder to understand. I think what they're looking for mostly is for the president to set up a blind trust like everybody before him has done before. But I think, the whole complex of attacks that are going on, the legal resistance that's using FOIA, it's incredibly important. There are so many FOIA requests being filed. The ACLU is obviously an incredibly important part of this. But looking into all of the financial dealings of the different cabinet secretaries and what's going on in their departments, and are there special favors being done? Who's being hired? Are they people with very problematic backgrounds? So this is all going on. I think there's a real flurry of activities, and how that may be something that people are going to be engaged in all over the country that will add ballast to the efforts of members of Congress who believe that we actually need to have a government that is not corrupt.
So about 3 months ago, I said the word emoluments to my non-lawyer husband, and he laughed and said, "You just made up that word." And I said, no, I didn't really, I swear, it's in the Constitution. My point being, I will put myself among those. I imagine if I asked for a show of hands of how many people in this room had heard the word emoluments before Trump came into office, it would not be a huge number. So to add a bit of a positivity to this, I think we are making progress, right? This room now can have a conversation about emoluments and the Emoluments Clause of the Constitution that we never would have had months ago, because people are getting educated, and educated people can have important conversations with each other and with their representatives and with public interest groups. So I think the first step, back to the theme of sort of what can people do, is we're doing it. We are becoming a much more educated population. We can talk about these issues, and then we can join up with others who are pushing these issues forward. So now we all know about emoluments, we can talk about it, we know it's a problem, and we can join up with groups like ACS or the ACLU who are pushing these issues forward. So looking for groups like that you can support either financially or with your voices and your time and your donation and your efforts, I think is the other way that we can all sort of get involved in pushing these issues through Freedom of Information Act requests and lawsuits. So educate yourselves and join up with groups and support those groups that are doing this.
Amen. The point you make about people getting smart on all of these previously technical and arcane subjects is so true. I mean, take a look at the healthcare debate, and the fact that you've got people all over this country now tuning in about why these insurance policy debates are basically very, very personal and important to their lives, the pre-existing conditions, high-risk pools, and this is stuff that would make people's eyes glaze over before. And now these are fighting words, and people are showing up at town halls armed with information and holding their representatives accountable. So that's good stuff. But I don't want to let you off the hook on conflicts quite yet, because I think we got more ground to cover there. In addition to the direct issue with Trump and the Emoluments Clause, we've seen a real lessening of ethical standards in this White House. There used to be a 2-year bar on folks coming into the administration and working in policy positions or in agencies that they lobbied within the last 2 years. The Trump administration lowered that and then started granting a whole bunch of secret waivers to people. The waivers used to be allowed under the Obama rules, but they were publicly posted. So you knew when someone got a waiver of the ethical rule, you knew it. The Trump administration has kept all of that secret. And there have been some other reductions in ethical standards. Comment on that, if you will, and what that means and whether there's any recourse for us on that.
Who wants to begin with that? You know, I actually was thinking of a question. I'm not trying to change the subject, but I'll link it to that, which is that, so ethics is obviously a huge issue, but what I've learned in the last couple of months with the Science March and sort of coalitions with different groups about solutions instead of sort of wringing our hands and saying this is terrible, they're terrible. So, it seems to me that there is a real role for business ethics and the business community to come forward and to really have a strong voice, which they can do, because there is such a thing as business ethics. And we're going to need some leadership in that area, or else it won't be as credible a criticism, I think. So I just did want to say that. And then as far as the lack of transparency, well, that goes hand in hand with the criticism of the press and with a lot of disparagement. I guess this is malevolent, ineffective disparagement of protesters. But certainly the idea that Trump thinks, okay, well, we can just stop the press from saying this, or they're not going to be able to report it anymore, and then actually shutting out the press room in the White House to certain people is very scary, because in that darkness, right, obviously the secrecy will thrive. But I think the larger point really that I've been thinking about is maybe trying to inspire some coalitions with the business community about how to handle this differently.
And I just wanted to give a shout out to a very brave public servant, Walter Schaub, who's the head of the Office of Government Ethics. It's an office that nobody really paid much attention to before. It's where people file all the forms they have to file when you become a federal employee, especially at a high level. You have to provide all sorts of background information. And he has been really, really pushing back, speaking out. He's speaking at forums. He is trying his very best until he goes the way of Jim Comey, right. To make sure that not only that the public is well aware of what is going on and how far below an appropriate standard the Trump administration is falling, but he is trying to actually enforce the rules. I think without Congress behind him, he's very weak. But to the extent, again, to come back to what all of you are doing in speaking out, it's so vital that your voices are heard to give strength to your representatives to do more, to push on these issues, and to bring in as many Republicans. The more this becomes a drumbeat, there are some of them who will start to listen. And when people hear you speaking out, people in other areas will start to speak out and bring pressure to bear on their members who may not be as enlightened as yours.
Okay. What about the children? We've got a White House full of relatives.
Those children.
We've got this family business with tentacles all over the world, pending intellectual property applications in China and other countries, decisions on some of those applications happening right after a Mar-a-Lago summit. I mean, this thing really doesn't smell right. You've got the Kushner family running over to China trying to drum up investments that will entitle Chinese folks to certain visas under rules that Jared Kushner and the Trump administration control. This web of conflicts and entanglements, how does the family connection come into this? And is there a nepotism angle here? Do we need to? Yeah. Obviously there is. Do we need to fundamentally modernize our conflict of interest and ethics laws in light of what's going on right now?
Yes. Well, yes. Yeah. I would just say one thing, which is the obvious huge hole is the president's not covered by most of these rules, and it has allowed him to get out of abiding by. Other presidents have actually set up trusts, blind trusts, voluntarily, out of an understanding that they were ethically, morally compelled to, even if there was no legally binding requirement. But I'd just say about the visas that were in the story, that is, again, back to what Margaret was saying, that's the Fourth Estate. That has come to light because there were good reporters out there, and that is why it is so important to have a free press. And, to the extent that we can do more to protect them, we must do that.
I just want to add to that. I don't know, I haven't heard the I word yet, impeachment, and I don't know if it's in any of the cards, but, and I'm not saying, So no, I'm not leading the drumbeat. However, this is where it does become very important to take it seriously, right? Because high crimes and misdemeanors. I mean, I think we learned through the Bill Clinton experience that there is no one definition of that, you know, perjury, but it's all quite conditional, right, upon the vote of the House and then eventually the vote of the Senate to convict. So if we have all of these not even more than rumblings, right? You know, just it smells rotten, right? And there's more and more investigation that's going on about the ties to Russia. What I see coming down the road is a situation in which staring us in the face is a set of violations of the law that will compel the Congress to consider that. And the question I guess I have is, could it ever happen with this Congress?
Mm-hmm. Are you looking to me?
Well, I don't know. Is there someone else who wants to answer that question? Because it will be staring us in the face.
I mean, here's where I'm going to be. I'm going to take over the role as the negative one on the panel. And this is, you know, I have no reason to think this, but my view has been we cannot expect or anticipate an impeachment. And, you know, I feel like, personally, I had this kind of stages of grief after the election, and I've come through to the other side of them, which is, I came through to acceptance, which had to predate resistance. And to the extent that I allow myself to believe that something is going to come in from the outside and he's going to resign because he decides he doesn't like it anymore, he's going to be impeached, and that we're going to be able to stop the fight at some point, that just sets me back into the denial stage of the stages.
They'll leave us for a younger country.
Right. We should be so lucky in these stages.
You know, you're probably right. It wouldn't happen, but I think we really need to have a serious discussion about it because this is terrible.
All right. Well, let's do that. Let's have that discussion. In fact, we've got some experts on sort of the constitutional framework and how a movement toward the impeachment of a president would actually take place. We've got a little bit of history to guide us. I think it took about 2 years to finally get the investigation rolling in Watergate, and that was when Democrats had control of the House of Representatives. That's where it has to initiate. I can just tell you my opinion from ground zero in the House of Representatives is that we don't have 218 votes to get started with an impeachment, but we might be able to change the dynamics on the investigations that would lead potentially to an impeachment. So those are sort of my thoughts, but I want to hear from you, the experts.
Well, so I think, you know, when you look back at Watergate and you see that the high crimes and misdemeanors is fairly open, and basically the most, I think, significant understanding you can have of it is that it's determined by politics. And that is what can be done. So, you know, the idea that there would be impeachment can only follow the will of the majority to impeach.
Right. Let's sharpen that just a little, Caroline. So, high crimes and misdemeanors. That's the language in the Constitution. Misdemeanors does not mean shoplifting.
No. Right.
No.
Right. Explain the definition of misdemeanors back in the late 1700s when that language, what did that mean and what should we take it to mean as we think about this standard today?
Well, I mean, I think the high crime certainly is easier to understand, right? It encompasses, you know, anything that murder. But there was also, you know, there's reference to bribery, corruption, and I think misdemeanor is more along the lines of that kind of activity. But ultimately, it really is dependent on what Congress thinks is unacceptable for a president to do, what is damaging to the national interest. Treason is obviously a grounds for impeachment.
That's a high crime.
It's a high crime. You know, when you look at sort of how it's been discussed over time, you see that there is really this understanding of how is the president doing damage to the nation? Yes. So when I say that, obviously that there are a lot of different reasons. So you could say the president could commit a crime, but it would be one that was perhaps, you know, not consequential enough that Congress might decide not to impeach and let the president serve his or her term and then suffer whatever consequences afterwards in the criminal justice system. Impeachment is a different order of process, right? It's about the integrity of our nation. So obviously you could say Donald Trump has done damage. But the point is, it's a political process. So if there's not a majority, there's not grounds for impeachment, right? So that's part of, I think, all of what we're talking about, all of the different elements of the resistance, whether it be people out in the streets or whether it be Emoluments Clause lawsuits or FOIA requests. It's about building the story that may help sway the debate that happens in Congress, may help sway what happens in 2018,
yep,
which then will affect what happens in Congress.
That's what I'm hoping. Certainly.
Other thoughts about impeachment?
I have many thoughts. No, sorry, go ahead.
I actually think what Caroline just said is critical, right? It is 2018. There are not the votes right now, but keeping up the sort of level of engagement over a period of years can be hard, right? There have been more people coming out to town halls and being engaged and working on political campaigns. Keeping that up through the 2018 midterm elections, finding where the nearest swing jurisdictions are, and going out and putting efforts in those jurisdictions and trying to shift the balance of power in 2018, I think is critical to, you know, not just to impeachment, but to all of the things that we've been talking about this evening and to changing the tides back in the right direction. So 2018, that should actually be our theme for tonight.
Right.
Yeah. Can I just say one more thing about the real power of public hearings and the drumbeat of attention. I guess I am sort of a Watergate baby in the sense that I was in school watching the Watergate hearings the summer, you know, that critical summer, and I was really mesmerized. And I think it had a lot to do with my decision, you know, majoring in history in college and then going off to law school. And I think we really owe generations after us, not just could we win on impeachment, but are we taking a stand for what we think is acceptable for our country or not? Because our kids are going to pay attention to that, and I certainly was paying attention to what was going on in the 70s when that was happening, when the hearings were happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the takeaway here is that the misdemeanor side of high crimes and misdemeanors is an inherently political conclusion based on harm to the country. The politics right now are not there in the House of Representatives to get that started, but if they feel enough pressure, that could change, and certainly if the House of Representatives majority change, that could change in a big way very quickly in 2 years. So.
Do we want what?
Pence.
Yeah. Well,
so that question does come up. If you get rid of Donald Trump, then you've got Pence, and he's smarter and, you know, more effective. I welcome thoughts about that. Frankly, I don't think that's any reason to keep in office a president who has flouted all of these laws and standards. But I would also say the idea that Mike Pence, who has been the chief apologist for Donald Trump for months, who was in charge of vetting during the transition. I mean, come on, folks. The idea that he gets through this without career-ending damage, I think, is pretty darn unlikely. So the other one that comes up a lot, I'm glad the impeachment issue was raised because we had a chance to speak to the elements of that. But the 25th Amendment comes up. So back to Sarah's, wishful attempt to find a way out of this. A lot of folks imagine a sort of intervention under the 25th Amendment where all of the cabinet officials that are enumerated under that amendment sort of wake up one day and realize that the country's in real trouble and they've got to take Donald Trump out. I don't really see that happening given the people he's put in charge of these agencies and these positions, but I would welcome any thoughts from you about that.
Are you looking at?
Any of you?
Any of you. So in the Sara, would this really happen camp, it hasn't, and I don't know that it would. I wouldn't bet on it. But it's led to this very interesting debate about both mental illness and stigmas around mental illness, and also a discussion of just what is wrong with the president. Because most people think, regardless of political opinions on various particular issues, there's a big problem, right? There's intemperate, paranoia, delusion, vindictiveness, endless tweeting, no sleeping. Something is not right. So the question is, what do we do about that? I don't think we've ever publicly faced that as a country. I mean, there have been times when presidents' illnesses have been swept under the rug, but how do we deal with a situation in which there seems to be some form of mental illness that needs to be addressed? We make fun of Trump, or many people make fun of Trump, and it's a really terrible thing to stigmatize and make fun of people with mental illness. However, it is. No, I'm very, very serious. So how do we deal with his condition? I am sort of puzzling over that. I'm a college classmate of one of the psychiatrists who's really kind of led the charge of saying, look, we're not individually diagnosing, but let me tell you, this person is narcissistic and delusional. It's a difficult question, but that's probably what bothers me the most when I wake up in the morning, actually, is his M-I-E-N.
I guess I just tend to be on the skeptic side of this one, in part because I don't see how really Betsy DeVos and Jeff Sessions can identify mental illness anyway.
All right, let's go, let's change gears and go to the First Amendment. I've got a question. Can you suggest how the problem of fake news and presidential lies can be addressed while protecting a core American value, the freedom of speech?
This really is up to all of us. I don't think anything can be done to stop fake news from being out there, because that is a First Amendment value. People have a right. And I've thought about this a lot. I really wanted to sue somebody over fake news. And I had students look at it, and I looked at it, and that pesky First Amendment kept getting in the way. But I think that it's fake news, and it's a president who creates fake news. This president is gaslighting us all the time. They say one thing, and then when you scratch beneath the surface, there's actually something entirely different going on. So even mainstream news is getting things wrong. So there's the fake news, there's just misleading news that's created by a misleading administration, but it is up to us to weed that out, because I don't think we can stop it from being out there. And this is what I was talking about before, about people becoming more educated. We need to read with skepticism. We need to read beyond the headlines. We need to double check sources and references. And when you see an article that seems a little bit off, Google it and see if anybody else is reporting it. Share the real news with your friends and your networks and your social networks and your peers. and become smarter, more educated readers of the media and hold the media accountable. But I don't think we can stop it from being out there. We have to do that hard work ourselves, and I think we are becoming savvier about it, but it's really going to be incumbent on all of us over the next years, 2, 4, however many years we have, to become smarter readers of the media and help each other to do that as well.
And Sara, before you pass the mic, what is a source, a trusted source of real news that you turn to?
I don't know, and this is not a dig at any particular news source. I don't think there's any one news source that I completely trust right now, in part because the administration is so misleading. So they put out press releases that say they're doing something that they're not really doing. We've seen this with the executive orders over and over again, where they say, we're going to issue an executive order that does these 8 million things. And when you look at it, it really does nothing. But because people are printing quickly and trying to get information out quickly in this internet age, media is putting out information before they have a chance sometimes to delve deeply. And then that gets shared so quickly and becomes the truth. So it's less about one particular media source. I mean, I think there are great media sources out there, but I think you always have to make sure you're reading beyond the headline and make sure that you're reading things in more than one place, and looking for the longer articles about things and double checking, because I don't know that there's anything that I would say you can always trust what you read in the first paragraph of the New York Times. Just because of sort of the world that we're living in right now.
As the others comment on this, I want to ask the same question of each of you. Where do you turn to for news that you can count on? Other than the Marin Independent Journal, of course.
First, I just want to say, before I get to that point, is that I actually think we also have to hold the press accountable. And, you know, I say this after following the French elections. You know, right at the last minute, there was a big dump of hacked emails from Emmanuel Macron. And what happened in France was that the major media decided not to cover it. They said, we actually want to look and see if this is accurate, because there was allegations that there was also all sorts of fake news and things that were sort of interspersed with real emails. And they said, you know, we could tip the election, or it could be a very definitive moment if we write all this stuff just as it's coming out. Instead, they said, you know, we don't have time to analyze it. And it's not good journalism just to push it out there. So, look, I mean, we're in a different environment. The First Amendment places us in a different place entirely. However, that doesn't mean we can't expect the best journalists in this country to actually adhere to some standards. And if there was more collaboration and agreement among them, that we would hold to some standards, and every time Hillary's emails are dumped out there and John Podesta asks somebody else about the risotto recipe, that doesn't make it into the New York Times. I mean, really, I actually would like to know John Podesta's risotto recipe, but I would ask him rather than want to see it in the New York Times because the emails were hacked. So I think there is more that can be done on that side. And I would say, I agree with Sara, though, that I tend to think people have to have a group of sources, you know, that they look at and cross-reference to make sure that they're getting the full story. Because even when you have a great reporter, they might not have all the facts. They might only have some of the facts.
Margaret, you want?
I actually wanted to talk about something different about the First Amendment.
Okay.
Because my news sources aren't all that interesting. So as long as we're talking about speech, various aspects of speech. So something that has troubled me quite a bit, and that I've been asked about a lot, is the proliferation of hate speech. And that has increased enormously, both in terms of the actual utterances, as well as the conflicts, the kind of conduct and hate group activities. So whether or not you can tie that to the Trump election, you know, I think is immaterial, because there's clearly been an uptick.
There's some lawsuits trying to tie that to him, aren't there?
Well, you mean the one about his statements at the rally? Yeah, about whether he was actually inciting violence, which I think you know, he possibly could have been. But what I'm concerned about is that, you know, often when I get this question to me as sort of an ACLU, civil liberties person, the question is, can the government lawfully ban that? And my answer is no, not unless it turns into actual conduct or assault or something that could be punishable in that way. However, it's really important, I think, under the First Amendment to realize that it only works when we speak out, when there is counter speech. And I'm very troubled that there aren't enough people speaking up against hate speech, because there's almost this sort of shoulder shrugging, well, you know, you can't censor it. But you sure as heck can say something about it, right? And there's a lot of racial violence, and there's particularly a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment going on. So, but whatever it is, anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim, racial violence, we need to do more, right? Or else the First Amendment free speech clause is not going to have any significance.
I just want to piggyback on that for 1 minute. Now that you've already hijacked the conversation and moved it in another direction, I'm going to keep it going that direction for a minute and bring it back a little bit to the immigration area that I've been working on, which is certainly there is a narrative when you talk about hate speech coming out of this administration that is anti-immigrant. There is a narrative that immigrants are criminals, that immigrants are all sorts of things that is sort of coloring the debate around immigration and these executive orders that we're seeing. And one thing that everybody needs to do, and we're trying to do in our litigation, and we need the help of everybody, is to change that narrative. And the way to change the narrative is to have a counter narrative. We need everybody talking about the ways that immigrants help our communities, the importance of having sanctuary city laws, the importance of having immigrants in our communities, and how it adds to us as a country and as a community and as a nation, and change the narrative from the horrible things that we are hearing coming out of the administration on immigrants. So I beseech you all in your sort of going about your lives to join us in that as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. This community, I think, strongly agrees with you on that. So a couple of questions that are a little bit off the path of accountability for the president, but I'll just take a quick stab at them because they were asked. One of them is about town hall meetings in other places. Apparently, I'm told my Republican colleagues are not having a lot of town halls right now.
They're frightened.
Yeah. And in fact, one of my Democratic colleagues took the unusual step of holding a town hall in one of those Republican districts because since Congressman Faso wouldn't explain his vote on health care, neighboring Congressman Sean Patrick Maloney decided he would go into that district and explain it for him. So the question is, do I plan on doing that? Why? I don't know. I'll think about it. I will say this. There's ways of doing something like that that I could be very interested in doing. If I were invited by a group of Democrats, you know, to a Democratic Party event, that's totally within the norms of politics to go into another district and do that. I can't use any of my I can't use any of my public resources, obviously, to you know. Okay, all right, yeah.
Is that okay?
So let's, to be continued, but I'm pleased to see that folks are not waiting for me to go into those districts. They're showing up and it's happening, and if I can find an appropriate way to answer questions on health care and other things in districts that want to hear from me, I'll find a way to do that. All right, and then I'm asked, what does Huffman think will happen on health care? I'll tell you. I think we've got to be vigilant. Obviously, this is a bill that very narrowly squeaked out of the House of Representatives. There will be a price to be paid for those who voted for it, and that is starting to be known. And I think one important thing is, as that price is paid, senators need to see it. Senators are not stupid, and as they watch the Republicans who voted for this terrible bill pay that price, they will get the message that they've got to do something very different. Will they finally wake up and reach across the aisle and work with Democrats on ways to make the Affordable Care Act better instead of this stubborn fixation on repeal and the inability to really replace it, because Republicans don't have too many good ideas to replace the Affordable Care Act? I don't know, but I think there's every reason to believe that the Senate is not going to pass anything too terribly close to what the House passed last week. And frankly, when I think about the path forward for this, if something did squeak out of the Senate on a party line vote, they can do it on 51 votes because it's under this thing called budget reconciliation. But if it did squeak out, it would have to be made much more moderate to bring on the Susan Collinses and any number of other senators, Lisa Murkowski and others. And that kind of a more moderate bill would come back and not pass in the House. So it's hard for me to imagine them threading this political needle within the Republican politics. And I certainly know there's no Democrats in either House that are going to support anything close to this bill. So I don't think they can get there, but I think we've got to stay vigilant, we've got to stay engaged, we've got to make that price paid by those who voted for it and make sure the senators do the right thing. Okay, I've got a lot of questions about this. This is back to the subject of accountability. All of the intimidation and cuts and modern-day book burning that's been happening effectively at the EPA, removal of climate science data from the website. Federal employees are scared. In the case of the EPA, the Trump administration is not only proposing massive cuts and trying to dampen their ability to do science, but they're also now dangling early retirement incentives to try to get rid of the professional civil servants that make that agency work. And so I've got a number of questions on the subject of how can the Trump administration be held accountable for what it's doing to these various government agencies, the vacancies that exist, the incompetent people that are being put in charge, the kind of intimidation, the political minders that are being placed almost like KGB agents in these various agencies to make sure that everything is according to the party line.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, there are a variety of different avenues, although they're all difficult. I mean, one thing I would start with, though, is that Trump sent up a budget, and Congress, thankfully, pretty much disregarded it when they passed their appropriations bill, funding the government through the end of the year. The cuts that he proposed were basically totally rejected. They did add some funding for the defense budget, but otherwise, I think Congress did mostly the right thing. I mean, we'd like to see other things funded more and maybe defense less. But by and large, what happened is not what Donald Trump was asking for. So there's some optimism in that. Of course, what happens next year is going to be a different story. They may have some more understanding of how the government works, branches of government and so forth, may put a little more thought into their budget process. But for this particular year, we've passed the worst part of it. But I think, there's obviously a great danger with the attrition of people with great expertise leaving the government, particularly scientists and others who are not going to be replaced. And that's something we can't really force. But one of the things that we're trying to do is working with our members all across the country, and we're an organization that is nationwide. We have chapters across the country in law schools, but also with lawyers. And they are researching who the staff is that's being brought in at the higher levels, so we have an understanding. Again, because the media is such an important player here, illuminating who is actually taking on an important position in government that may not require Senate confirmation, and making sure that the public knows who these people are. And that's a vital piece of this, as well as protecting whistleblowers. We do have whistleblower protection statutes, and we are working with the variety of organizations, the unions and others that are there to stand with the federal workforce. But that's going to be a vital piece of this, as is ensuring that there are members of Congress, like Congressman Huffman, who people can come to tell stories about what's happening inside the agencies. But this is a very, very difficult moment for all of us, and I think we have to be very vigilant in watching what happens.
All right, here's a question back on the sanctuary city immigration issue. The questioner notes that a recent poll, or states that a recent poll showed 75% of Californians oppose sanctuary cities. What am I doing about it? Let me, I'm certainly happy to speak to what I'm doing about it. I disagree with those who oppose sanctuary cities. However, this is a reference to a poll, and I can sort of imagine that that poll question framed sanctuary cities in a specific way, and I wonder if you might get a very different answer if you asked that question differently that didn't use a loaded, politicized term like sanctuary cities. So I guess it's an opportunity to talk about how that term has become somewhat loaded and where people are going with it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think there is no definition of the term sanctuary city. I think that it has been sort of corrupted and co-opted by the right into meaning jurisdictions that protect criminals. Right. And that is not what it means. But again, we're losing this narrative. The narrative is getting away from us. And so when people hear the term sanctuary city, they think, I mean, it's like I've got criminals hiding under my desk at the office in San Francisco. We all just hide them under there and try to protect them. And that's not what sanctuary cities are. So I think part of it is depending on how the question is asked, and part of it is how we all talk about sanctuary jurisdictions. Sanctuary jurisdictions exist across the country in almost every major city because cities have looked at it and determined that if we don't take steps to protect immigrants, then we all suffer. It's not about protecting criminals, it's about protecting children whose families are going to be split up. It's about protecting all of our health so that people feel safe going to doctors and taking their children to be immunized. It's about protecting us from crime so that people feel safer reporting crimes to police and cooperating with police. And when you have those conversations about what our sanctuary city laws really do and who they protect and why they're important, the conversation starts to change dramatically. So yes, I question those poll numbers, and I question the narrative, and that we all need to, again, talk about these issues very differently because we are letting the term be corrupted and co-opted into something that it was never meant to be.
You know, I think there's also a real irony here, you know, that conservatives who've talked for so long about state and local control, all of a sudden want cities across the country to enforce federal law and have law enforcement be immigration officers instead of doing their jobs, being a cop on the beat and protecting their community. And so I think there's also that part of the narrative about ensuring that communities actually have a say about how their law enforcement resources are deployed, and not having Jeff Sessions back in DC tell you here in California that your cops should be deporting people instead of going after people who commit crimes.
Yeah, a related question. Margaret, did you want to speak to that?
I concur.
Okay. So a related question. I have a number on this subject, and several people ask, what can we do to make sure as a state, as a local community, that we are not participating in the rounding up and deportation of nonviolent, undocumented immigrants? And there's a reference to making sure that the sheriff and the police are not targeting and doing this. I will just tell you, here in Marin County and pretty much throughout my district, I'm assured in very clear terms by sheriffs and local police officers that that's not what they do. And they are committed. You know, you can call it sanctuary, you can call it whatever you want. Santa Rosa just passed a resolution, for example, calling themselves an indivisible city. They chose to use that term. But I am finding an almost uniform commitment in local government and in law enforcement at the local level to convey to people that at routine traffic stops and all the various things they do, they're not asking for documentation, they're not enforcing immigration laws, and even with folks who have been jailed for nonviolent crimes and don't have, felony warrants and things like that, they're not even honoring ICE detainer requests. So I think the things that many of us want to see happening from our local leaders are happening here in this community, but I want to invite others to speak to the same issue.
So there's local legislation and there's state legislation that is pending right now. SB 54 would create some sanctuary protections statewide. So I think this is really an area where there are opportunities to reach out to your local and your state representatives and support these types of laws. These debates are actively happening right now, and so letting people know that you support SB 54, that you support local sanctuary laws, indivisible laws, whatever they're called, but that this is an important issue for our local politicians to focus on and our state politicians to focus on, really is that we're at a critical moment on these debates right now. The ACLU is also doing a lot of really great work in this regard. They have I think it's called People Power, sort of call to action right now where they are training people to go out and meet with sheriffs and police departments and talk about the local policies. So that is a great way to sort of get involved in a very local, very direct way. Just Google ACLU People Power, and that can also be a way to sort of aid in this effort.
Okay. Good.
And just one more group in addition to peoplepower.org, there's also freedomcities.org. Both places can really give you grassroots ideas of how to get involved.
Oh, that is a perfect segue to the last question I have. One of our participants in this forum asked all the panelists to please name 3 organizations you would recommend we support. I can't do that as a congressman in a public event, but I can't stop you from doing it. So
I think we all have to say ACS.
Yes, right. We've already said one.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, who wants? So these are just the 3 of many that come to mind. Obviously, the ACLU and ACS. I would also say, especially since immigration has come up, that NILC, the National Immigration Law Center, and I would actually encourage lower profile organizations that are doing work in terms of immigration and sanctuary and civil liberties, because as you probably heard, the National ACLU got more money in one weekend than it got, in a whole year. I think it was the weekend of inauguration. And so it's good to sort of spread those donations around if you could.
I don't think I actually have anything else to add to that. I think those are great suggestions.
there you go. Somebody.
Oh, of course, choice, Planned Parenthood and NARAL critical also, absolutely.
Okay. Good. Well, folks, we have gone a little bit over the time for this conversation, but I think it was worth it. It was a great discussion.
Thank you.
And
good job, you guys.
I thank you for letting me moderate. Gives me a chance to be moderate, so that's kind of fun. And I hope you'll join me in thanking our incredible panelists, starting with Caroline Fredrickson, Sara Eisenberg, and Margaret Russell.
Good job.
All right. Thank you.